All right, well, thanks for everyone's patience. We had some bus delays this morning, so we started a few minutes late. Thank you for joining us today for this session on cutting-edge integrity solutions for the climate crisis. My name is Ali Rahim. I head the Global Partnership for Social Accountability, hosted by the World Bank, which is the bank's dedicated civil society platform. We're also doing a lot of work right now on climate accountability. We've launched a global green accountability initiative that's trying to bring systematic civil society partnerships into climate finance oversight. And very excited to have a great panel with us today. The event builds on the second symposium on supranational responses to corruption, focused on integrity in climate finance and action. That took place in May 2024 in London, organized by the World Bank and the Green Climate Fund and Transparency International. It included a call for papers and convened a diverse array of stakeholders, including representatives of IFIs, funders, academia, and civil society, to explore the intersection of climate action and integrity agendas. We have a lot of key themes that were highlighted in that symposium that you'll hear about today, ranging from social accountability in climate solutions and participation, carbon markets integrity, the role of IFIs, and the private sector engagement in the climate integrity space. And so very excited to have a great panel here today, and I'll do a brief introduction of the panelists, and then we'll dive into some of the conversation. So starting at the right next to me, we have Karina Gilfillian, Senior Analyst at the UNCAT Coalition. Karina brings over 20 years of work experience on human rights, good governance, and environmental protection. Before she joined the UNCAT Coalition, she was the head of the U.S. Office for Global Witness. She's worked extensively on corruption, human rights, and recently also on the climate agenda, and has also worked at the United Nations Environment Program in the past. Shirley Pouget is the legal director at DLA Piper. She has worked on recent mandates on the identification and mitigation of social risk in the conservation environment sector. She's worked for 20 years advising clients on human rights and compliance with international and national frameworks, including the UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights, and the OECD guidelines and the French vigilance laws. So thank you for joining us. We also have at the far end is Michael Jarvis. Michael Jarvis heads the Trust, Accountability, and Inclusion Collaborative, which is a philanthropic collaborative bringing support to good governance, accountability, and corruption integrity issues. He's worked for over 2 decades as a leader in good governance and development agendas, including a long career at the World Bank, where he was global lead for extractives governance in the governance practice of the World Bank. And Michael has been working extensively recently on these issues in the climate context. So very glad you could join us. And then we have, sorry, I'm just jumping around my bios in the list here, so thanks for your patience. And then we have Felipe Rocha dos Santos, who's counsel at the World Bank. He's part of the Sanctions Board Secretariat. He also supports a Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative. Prior to this role, he worked for a law firm in Washington, D.C. and Paris, where he represented multinational companies on anti-corruption matters, managed integrity due diligence reviews, and provided risk-based advice on country business operations. He's recently also been focusing research on climate integrity issues, which he'll speak to on this panel. And last but not least at all, we have Anouk de Soysa, who's a climate governance specialist at Transparency International. He's a professional in vertical accountability and working with the Climate Governance Integrity Program at Transparency International. He's previously worked at the Asia Foundation and as an independent consultant working for agencies ranging from the UN, the Asia Foundation, and BRAC. And he has deep expertise in social accountability, which you'll hear about later today. So, diving into the conversation, we're going to try and make this a conversation, is, turning to Shirley. Shirley, you presented some very interesting research in London on existing regulatory frameworks and the relevance to integrity risk related to climate solutions. And you found there's, a lot of legislation that exists in the world, but a need for tailored legislation and regulatory frameworks, and that not all these frameworks are currently being effectively applied to climate. So could you provide us some insight about why these existing frameworks are not necessarily effective, why they may not be as effective for climate, and how we address this issue moving forward?
Good morning, everyone. Just some background to that piece of research. So DLA Piper and the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change at the London School of Economics published a study on corruption and integrity risks in climate solutions. So we've been looking at regulatory frameworks in 7 jurisdictions. And yes, we have identified 3 categories of risk, right? So diversion of financial flows, climate washing, and abuse of processes. And so when we've analyzed those regulatory frameworks, and that includes international conventions as well, we found that all those legislations apply to the climate context. However, they are not being applied mainly because governments are struggling to know how to apply these to climate and in the context of climate. So yes, we do need to get more specialized guidance and legislations. Those laws can be applied. However, governments are struggling, but also, the civil society is struggling, and the private sector is also struggling to make a link between, anti-corruption conventions and climate solutions and action. And also, beyond, guidance, specific guidance. So UNCAC, for example, could come up with a 2-pager saying, yes, the International Convention on Corruption can apply to climate, and how can you apply it? We also believe that, in some circumstances and in some jurisdictions, specialized climate legislations are needed. There's a gap to be filled, however, in terms of voluntary carbon markets. There's clearly a need for oversight and accountability. And now when you look also at ESG ratings agencies, there's no oversight. So those needs to be regulated for sure. But when it comes to diversion of financial flows or even climate washing, most of the consumer protection laws can actually be applied to climate. However, in the EU, we start seeing specialized legislations to tackle climate washing. But yes, more awareness and more guidance so that governments can actually handle climate and use existing legislations.
Thank you, Shirley. Karina, one of the things you've spoken extensively about is the need for a more participatory role for civil society in decision-making processes. What strategies can we use to ensure that civil society is not just consulted, but becomes central to how the decision-making process and climate finance governance occurs, all the way from the decisions on what's prioritized, to the allocation of financing, through to monitoring, and sort of ensuring the quality and impact of climate finance and action?
Thank you. It's Friday, so thank you very much. And just briefly to introduce the work that the UNCAC Coalition, I'm here on behalf of the UNCAC Coalition's Environmental Crime and Corruption Working Group. And we're a working group of over 200 members, civil society organizations and other experts from across the globe. And for the symposium, we undertook a research project, basically, to look at how we could use different conventions, including the UNCAC, to tackle the climate crisis. And a major component of that research was looking at civil society participation in climate finance and also in climate action. And as we've been hearing throughout the week, civil society, obviously more broadly in corruption and anti-corruption efforts, has a huge role to play in accountability, right? In making sure particularly that governments and the private sector are actually taking action. And then also, as you had referenced, actually not going beyond that, far beyond that, actually being a very active player and decision maker in, for example, how climate funds are deployed, how they're implemented on the ground, in really making sure that they deliver not just in tackling the climate crisis, but also in many other objectives, at the community level and national levels and international levels. So what we found through our research is that there is a very important need for taking a participatory approach in these climate finance approaches. And I think we're going to hear from other speakers about very specific ideas on that. But I think it's very, very important to highlight the fact that civil society cannot play this role. And when I talk about civil society, I'm talking about a broad range of actors, whether it's civil society organizations, think tanks, those playing more of a watchdog role, obviously journalists, investigative journalists, a whole wide range of stakeholders, but that they're not going to be able to play that role unless there is a safe and enabling environment for them to do so. And as we've heard throughout the week, that can be a challenge in many contexts. So I think that when we're developing solutions and approaches, we need to make sure that that safe and enabling environment is there, especially, as we see with the human rights defenders working at the community level to make sure they can operate freely from threats, harassment, and intimidation. So we want national protection laws that are protecting indigenous peoples, community organizations, defenders, and activists that are exposing the corruption, because that's a lot of times when an important part of it is exposing the corruption in the environmental sector, and also in these climate finance and adaptation projects that are going to need to be at the local level. And I just wanted to also highlight that as we saw today, there was a lot of attention to Dr. Gubadi Baduglu as an example of an activist who's exposed corruption in the oil gas sector in Azerbaijan. That's a very clear, stark example, and where we need the international community, the World Bank, and others to really be speaking out in support of these defenders and really having early warning systems to make sure that, to try to prevent that from happening. And just a few other things to highlight. So I mentioned the need for participatory approaches in these climate mitigation adaptation projects where non-governmental stakeholders are actually at the center of the decision making, and they're involved through the whole project. We also need to address access to information. That's absolutely critical to have the information, whether it's beneficial ownership registries, decisions around allocation of contracts. For example, in the environmental sector, there's a whole range of access to information needs that oftentimes aren't met. Even if there are laws on the books or there's beneficial ownership disclosure, are there public registers that should be deployed to tackle the climate crisis? So those are just a few of the things. It's hard in a couple of minutes to summarize it all, but those are some of the key themes, and then others will expand on some of those ideas.
Thanks, Karina. I'm going to turn to Felipe now. Coming from one of the world's largest financiers of climate actions in developing countries, what are some of the pragmatic solutions the World Bank is using to mitigate integrity risks in climate finance, and how this relates to some of the key frameworks that are out there?
Good morning. So thanks for that. But I'll begin just by stating and sharing that we're very proud of the work the World Bank has been doing on climate. There has been a renewed emphasis on that as of recent. And for this year alone, we've already committed to dedicating 45% of our funding to climate-related projects. So that will be over $40 billion just this year alone. So it is a lot of money, and we have to do everything we can to protect this money. And it's actually the World Bank has a fiduciary duty to make sure that these funds are managed efficiently and effectively, and that they're only used for their intended purposes. So fighting fraud and corruption is actually a core part of the World Bank's mandate, not only to prevent waste, but also to make sure that these funds are reaching the intended beneficiaries and that we are actually achieving the goals of these projects that we're funding. But just to, of course, we do a lot to achieve that and to fight corruption as well. And I'll highlight a few points for you today. So the first one is that we actually provide technical assistance and capacity building directly to our client countries. So we help these developing countries with their governance to improve their institutions, we help them enhance and improve their legal frameworks and their procurement regulations as well to make sure that they are able and they have the tools and the capacity to actually address these risks and fight fraud and corruption themselves as well. So a lot of our attention and resources go into governance directly with these countries. And in addition to that, we also invest in producing and sharing knowledge. So as you mentioned, we had, for example, this symposium that we helped organize in London, focused on the intersection between climate and integrity as well. And if you've attended any of the other climate sessions that we've had at this conference this week, you've probably heard we've also worked with the UNODC on preparing a guidance note specifically relating to integrity risks in climate action and finance. So these are just a few examples of our investment in research and in scholarship on this area, as well as a means to raise awareness and educate not only the general public but also our client countries on these risks and the pitfalls that they need to avoid when engaging in and funding climate action as well. And finally, the last avenue for fighting fraud and corruption that I'd like to highlight, and to me, that's the most important because that's where I come in. And that's also the most closely related to the protection of these funds that I mentioned and our fiduciary duties. So it's the fighting of fraud and corruption in connection with our own projects. So we have a variety of mechanisms and safeguards that we implement in connection with the projects that we fund, and they actually attach to these funds that we provide. So whenever we agree to provide funding or grants or we invest in any projects, we impose a variety of integrity standards. We include anti-corruption safeguards and clauses in our funding agreements. And these standards have to be cascaded down by the client countries into the procurement documents, into the contracts that they sign with the companies and the individuals that will be providing those goods and those services and those works in connection with World Bank funds. So that includes very strict rules on conflicts of interest, procurement rules that are designed to ensure transparency and fairness and the competitiveness of the process to make sure that you're getting the best value out of your money. And of course, also very strict and explicit prohibitions against fraud and corruption. And that also allows us to have proper oversight over the procurement that is conducted using our funds. And that includes wherever all of these safeguards and these mechanisms that we have in place to prevent fraud and corruption, whenever that doesn't work and an instance of misconduct or fraud or corruption actually takes place, we actually have a means to conduct oversight and audit these private parties that are receiving and using our funds in connection with these projects. So if we do verify that misconduct has occurred, we can investigate, we can audit them, and we can also sanction them. And in most cases, that means we'll be excluding these bad actors from doing business with us in the future. So this is what we call the sanction system at the World Bank. We call it debarment. The idea there is that you identify these individuals and these companies that have misused our funds in the past, so they present a higher risk to our operations, and we address that most immediately by excluding them from doing business with us. And as just my last point in this, just as it relates specifically to climate, of course, we have this new focus that I mentioned on climate-related projects. And there's a lot of volume of resources being poured into these projects with a lot more speed as well. So that raises the risk profile of these projects as well. And we are currently already working on ways to reflect that raised risk profile into our investigative tools, into our sanctioning mechanisms as well. So we're incorporating these climate-related integrity risks into our risk matrix to select the allegations and the reports of misconduct that will be subject of full investigations. And we have already begun as well to extract sector-specific data from those investigations so that we can extract lessons learned from that as well to inform and improve our own investigative practices, but also to help us identify any potential weaknesses in our operational controls and potential gaps in our framework as well. And these are lessons learned that we can also share with our client countries and with the general public to make sure that everyone is aware of those red flags, those common risks, those most common fact patterns that show up as relates to climate-related projects so that we can better address and mitigate those risks as well.
Thank you, Felipe. So, thinking of the volume of finance that's increasing dramatically and quickly, often going into lower governance environments, environments with strained capacity, it underscores, as Karina was starting to get at, the importance of broad range of participation and demand-side oversight. So, Anouk, could you tell us a little bit about the role of public participation in social accountability in ensuring transparency and integrity, and also ensuring the quality of the delivery of climate finance in action?
Thank you so much, Ali, and good morning, everyone. That's a great question. I think Karina started getting to it, so I'll try and delve a little deeper, I guess. I think the question should also be how can sort of the public not be fundamental to these processes. Not just the fact that the climate crisis is one of the existential crises of our times. The voices of people need to be at the center of this. So the urgency of it, I think, is one aspect of it. We talk about, the fact that the impacts of climate change affect the most vulnerable and marginalized communities at the most times, and not having those voices at the table is also going to be obviously of great concern. We find, I think, as someone reminded me as well, that the voices that are often represented are those that exacerbate the crisis, and I think hearing the voices that are often victims is perhaps as critical to this. So I think those are the fundamental compulsions for public participation, and sort of making sure that the quality of participation is very important. But I think beyond this, it's linked to a diversity of both supply and kind of demand-side factors, and I'll try to summarize it, I guess, in three core areas. The first, I think, is that public participation and meaningful social accountability strengthens kind of democratic processes, right? In this context, or this global context of dwindling trust in institutions, you have large amounts, as we've already heard, of climate finance going into different projects. The people are often disillusioned about what comes out of it, and I think ensuring that people have a seat at the table, both inclusively and meaningfully, so not just tick box exercises, but very meaningfully, I think can help restore this sense of trust in institutions, which I think is a critical kind of pull factor. The other thing sort of speaks to the question of inclusivity and kind of making sure that climate finance, climate action reaches those voices that aren't often part of normal processes. So making sure that you are democratizing processes to ensure that underrepresented and marginalized communities have a seat at the table, and kind of enhance voices to ensure that those needs and priorities are heard. And it's not the needs and priorities of where necessarily the money always comes from. And I think the other one is a very practical incentive that can go both in terms of a supply side factor and a demand side factor, where it increases fiscal efficiency, right? I think it's not just a question of identifying a climate project or a climate finance initiative that you feel is going to be efficient, but actually involving people, making sure that you're responding to these needs will save you time later down the line. So you're having efficiency gains. I mean, there was a conversation around carbon markets a few days ago as well, which speaks about verification processes and needing to have people at the table. The misdirection of a lot of those efforts, those carbon market projects, speaks to the fact that people were not adequately consulted right at the start of the process. And I think here, those efficiency gains are things that we need to highlight, even as civil society, to sort of strengthen this claim of public participation in climate-related processes. This is a broad sweep of some of the core factors. I mean, I'd like to talk about enabling factors for participation, but perhaps I'll leave that for a follow-up question.
No, a great framing, and I mean, there's a lot of discussion about climate democracy and climate justice, and there's a direct linkage to climate finance and a need for a climate or a green accountability that we need to bring to really operationalize those movements, and so that's very interesting framing, Anouk. Michael, turning to you, looking at the range of stakeholders we need to bring together to effectively achieve climate action. Often, in the climate discussions, which are highly technical and the challenges are highly technical, but the delivery of this, as we're hearing from this panel, involves a broad political economy, involves a broad ecosystem of funders, of implementers. As someone who is running, a philanthropic collaborative and building a lot of these connections between government, civil society, and the private sector, can you tell us a little bit more about how we effectively drive these kinds of coalitions to ensure we have integrity and quality in climate finance and action? And how do we ensure that this is all well-resourced and systematically funded? Because some of these stakeholders have more easy access to finance than others.
Yeah, thanks, Ali. So from our side, I think what we're seeing is there's a huge range of accountability needs across the climate space, and a lot of it is under-resourced in practice. And I think part of what we need to do is help make the case that not only are these accountability gaps a problem, but actually that they are solvable. And we partnered with the World Bank on a piece of research that was led by Systemic Splendid Finance Task Force, and they were able to calculate that there is a real opportunity here. Like, if we were able to build in effective accountability mechanisms across the volumes of climate finance, like, that could save as much as 100 billion a year, which, when we're talking about how, huge sums in the climate finance space. But the point is that these things they pay for themselves. They have a high return. But it's not the first instinct that people come to. It's not the first thing that most climate finance groups think about. And there tends to still be a perception, I think, that enabling participation, building accountability mechanisms is something that has to slow you down, and that we've got this urgency around the climate agenda that makes people think, oh, we'll build that stuff later. But the point is, if you don't build it in from the beginning, you miss the opportunity to make those savings, and you actually cost yourselves more in the future. So I think there's a narrative piece that we need to collectively work on about how to change that perception. And I think we can learn a lot from both the institute, the mechanisms that we're hearing about that the bank has and that other organizations have from a fiduciary risk perspective. But we also need to think about the risks, as Anouk was saying, of communities and what they miss out on if we don't build these pieces in. So I think the 2 points I'll say is, there's one, we can learn a lot from what's already been tried. Like, we're talking about turning research into practice. There was a recent review of over 157 social accountability cases that came through the GPSA process. And those point to a whole new model of how to do social accountability projects. And there's a lot there that we can learn on and integrate into climate projects. There's a lot we can learn from the COVID response, which also had this issue of urgency and the sense that, we just override good practice in this context. But actually, there were some really good innovative oversight mechanisms that got put in place to track COVID funds, including from civil society, that we can translate over and think about what's the equivalent in the climate finance space. There's effective sort of evolutions of platforms where different voices come together to determine and oversee allocation of funds. And here I'd look to the Global Fund from the health space. They've got over 20 years now of building these national country platforms where they come to realize that they do need more participation built into the decision-making around those funds. And they found that the more they made those processes inclusive and reflecting community needs down to local level, when they ran the audits, they then found that they were actually saving money and making those projects were more effective. So, you can be an effective altruist in this space and still understand why you need to be funding better accountability in climate finance. And even some of the early research in the climate space. Like there's some interesting work, particularly in adaptation finance. An UNCTAD sort of a flag that sort of 1 in 6 adaptation projects are at high risk of maladaptation because of these integrity risks. But there's interesting work out there, for example, from SOAS, looking at projects in Bangladesh, where if you engage communities in the design of those adaptation projects, and they assure that there's sort of win-win benefits for them, and like often this is building, for example, community centers that also serve as being resilient in climate emergencies and a place for people to gather safely, but they also provide like the facilities that they want on a day-to-day basis. Those communities play a much more active role then in engaging in the project, making sure it's actually delivered on time, on cost, and then functions and is maintained afterwards. So we know it makes sense. I think part of the problem is we still have a big funding gap, and this is where our end is. We did some analysis of what money is going to these types of issues, this intersection of climate and anti-corruption and integrity. The first thing to say is that anti-corruption financing is minuscule. So if you look at overseas development assistance, ODA, from 2018 to 2022, which is the latest data we have, it was 0.12% of ODA was tagged as anti-corruption funding. Philanthropic funding, and the most reliable data is US philanthropic funding, so this is a caveat to that, but that's still the lion's share of overall global philanthropic funding. It was 0.09% that was labeled as anti-corruption funding. And then if you look at climate finance, on the US philanthropy side, for that same period, 2018 to 2022, they spent over 7.4 billion on things they labeled as climate. When you try and search through the keywords, like how many of those mention integrity, anti-corruption, transparency, those types of issues, you only get 75 million show up as actually sort of having a direct link to these types of issues. And then when you look at what percentage of that is going to groups based in the global south, it's less than 10%. So the sums we're talking about that are already going to these integrity solutions, these are being bootstrapped, like they're not adequately resourced. So we need to make a case to philanthropy, to bilateral donors, to multilateral donors, to use your respective comparative advantages, and let's build a funding ecosystem that supports what we know can really work in a meaningful way, and you'll get a really good bang for your buck, and that's great for your publics back in the UK or wherever you are, but ultimately, most importantly, it's good for the publics who are suffering from climate change impacts right now.
No, thank you, Michael. And, that notion of pennies on the dollar that need to be spent to assure the quality of financing, I think goes to sort of the nature of the overall climate challenge overall. What are small investments in the upstream that allow us to effectively utilize those funds and improve the quality of overall capital? And so turning to that issue and the why, and I think some of you started to get into this, the why of the climate crisis and the climate integrity challenge being different from integrity challenges more generally. And, we had a panel on this about a year ago at the anti-corruption conference the World Bank hosted, and there was a debate on that panel about whether it's different. And I think the majority of the panel came to the consensus that, yes, it is different for a lot of fundamental resources. One is, the quantum of finance and the uptick and the curve in that change in finance is probably one of the most dramatic we will see in human history. And two, that the waste we can afford to have has never been lower, right? The finance is limited. The pathways we have to get to the 1.5 or less changes we're trying to achieve through mitigation require us to really have every dollar effectively well spent to reach our goals. So it is a different context, I think most of us would agree, but would love reflections from some of you, Karina, maybe turning to you first, about one, how you think why it's different, and two, how that should change the response and the enabling environment we need to create to address that difference.
Thank you.
You shouldn't have to.
I've used a microphone before. It might not appear that way. Yes. So I think there's another. I would identify another reason, and this is what the we focused on in our research for the symposium, and that's that looking at how these different issues are converging. So you have corruption. And you also have organized crime. And if you look at the corruption facilitating the crime, the organized crime that is basically, fueling these environmental crimes, right? Those are crimes where you have breaking environmental protection laws, right? So you have like illegal wildlife trade, unregulated, illegal, fishing, illegal logging. These are all environmental crimes, and you have corruption facilitating that. So you have that interlinkage, and then that is one of the factors driving the climate crisis. And so I think that that's another reason why you need to have a tailored approach, okay? So what we did in our research was to look, and there's a growing recognition that many environmental crimes are undertaken by organized criminal groups, and that's causing climate change. It's also causing human rights abuses, all of these other impacts locally, right? So it's far broader than just climate change. But if we're looking at climate change, it's a big issue, this convergence. And also with drug trafficking, if you want to, so there's a lot of ways these things are converging. So in our response to tackling climate change, we need to look at those interlinkages and to look at what's the impact on the climate. And then we also need to develop responses to adequately reflect that. And so in our research, we looked at what are the different policy tools, international mechanisms that should be deployed. And we focused on 3, although there are more, but we focused on the UN Convention Against Corruption, the UN Convention on Tackling Transnational Organized Crime, the UNTOC, and the UNFCCC, right? Obviously as the main framework for tackling climate change. And we've come out with some recommendations. We're going to put this out in a report, but we've come out with some recommendations specifically on, as Shirley had mentioned, deploying the UNCAC, which is the the only legally binding universal anti-corruption instrument. And if you look at that, there are so many articles in that convention that are very, very relevant to tackling this problem. Whether it's conflicts of interest, the bribery, the beneficial ownership, the money laundering. There's very many international cooperation, asset recovery. And so, but the question is, how do you deploy those frameworks? And I think that, we want to see the UNCAC, like Shirley had said, come out with specific guidance on how anti-corruption frameworks should be deployed, and also bringing in environmental protection agencies, other agencies, that need to be brought in to make sure that it's tackling climate change, right? So all of the different government agencies, the law enforcement, et cetera. So, but having that specific guidance, and then, through technical assistance, through policy development, through other mechanisms that are in the UNCAC, trying to make that happen on the ground with civil society. So that's the other main conclusion. These need to be done in a cross-sectoral approach with civil society organizations integrally involved, and multi-stakeholder initiatives, which also can be important. The same with the UNTOC. That provision says environmental crimes are there. You could use the provisions there to make sure that environmental crime is a predicate offense or a serious crime, really deploying the UNTOC provisions to tackle the climate crisis, but then promoting interlinkages between those different bodies. So having them mainstream the interlinkages in each of those bodies. We want to have an UNCAC cost resolution that recognizes this problem, and on deploying the UNCAC for climate change and tackling environmental crime and climate change. And how about working with the UNFCCC? Have some follow-up actions in that resolution for the UNCAC to work with the UNFCCC, for the relevant subsidiary bodies to work together. There's a lot that can be shared between the two conventions on trying to address this. What about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change? Looking more at governance and corruption issues, how that could be undermining achieving climate mitigation and adaptation goals. Right now, there's really not enough focus in those reports. Why can't we use the UNCAC corruption experts and other corruption experts, or anti-corruption experts, to be working with the IPCC? So I think that those are kind of some highlights of some recommendations that we would like to see. And we'd like to see that advance in all of these different fora. The UNTAC COP is coming up this fall. So what could be done more explicitly there to tackle climate change and to make those linkages with the UNFCCC, as well as the UNCAC as well, more UNCAC linkages as well, building on a resolution that was passed last December on organized crime and corruption and trying to promote more cooperation to tackle the linkages. So those are just some ideas, that we will be coming out with a report and actually citing many of you all and many of the experts from the symposium, and it's really encouraging to see the World Bank tackle this issue, and also be putting out these papers too about how more action should be taken to address integrity. And I would just say to the bank that, again, as I said earlier, we need a safe and enabling environment for civil society to really play this crucial role, and also in whistleblower protection and reporting, which I have not put. That's absolutely crucial, for really exposing corruption and driving climate change. But I would really call on the bank to do more, when it's developing its loans and grants and programs in countries, to really think up front, how can we support a safe and enabling environment? How can we support strong whistleblower protection and reporting programs? How can we actively support civil society? For example, Dr. Gubad, the Azerbaijan government has received an enormous amount of, loans and financing and support from the World Bank. I think there was just like a 20th anniversary, celebration of this. But in the midst of this, Azerbaijan is locking up, journalists, anti-corruption fighters like Dr. Gubad. There's political prisoners. They're locked up. The COP is coming. And I would just urge the bank to do more, to use its leverage behind the scenes, but also when it's developing these programs in countries with all of these governance problems. And this is going to help with the climate crisis too, if we can improve this enabling environment in these countries so that this World Bank financing and other types of financing will actually deliver. Because if you have a strong, vibrant civil society that can monitor, in all sorts of different ways and expose corruption, that will really help to make sure the money and these efforts actually achieve the intended goals and aims.
No, thank you, Karina. And I think it underscores that both, the supply and demand side of governance need to come together to really ensure that climate finance and action can have the impact that's intended. And we have all these powerful international agreements and tools and frameworks, but the challenge is applying them in different contexts is very difficult. And so, turning to you, Shirley, is there a way, we have all these provisions, we have the international frameworks, but you have very different legal and regulatory contexts in a lot of the countries, especially in developing countries. What are ways that, especially in some of these low governance environments, especially in some of these low capacity environments where the traditional approaches may be difficult to achieve, what are ways in which we can support governments, civil society, and other stakeholders to provide more effective oversight, to ensure integrity? These aren't cookie cutter solutions. What will work in the United States and in the EU may not work in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, but the principles remain the same. So how do you address these different contexts effectively and really leverage the strong international provisions we have available to us?
Yeah, thank you. So picking up on what you've just said about lack of funding of anti-corruption actors, I think this is where we should be, giving some thoughts, because, on the one hand, and you're talking about lower emerging economies here, but if you look at the UK, for example, and in a past life, we were building grand corruption cases in the UK, right? So we were building the cases, we were looking for the evidence, we were, trying to trace the money, and even, if we were going to the SFO in London saying, we've got a case for you. Can you please, open an investigation and prosecute? And they are under-resourced and understaffed. And, initiating prosecution, grand corruption prosecution it's costly and it requires a lot of money. So when I hear what you're saying in terms of how much funds is going to anti-corruption regulators and actors, That's where the issue is, right? Because if you want strong governance in the global south and in the global north, we need funding being allocated to where we're talking about integrity risks and climate. We need a lot of funding to go to tackle the climate crisis. And interestingly, when we were doing that research and we were in Sharm, people were saying, the last message you want to convey is, because of all the corruption and integrity risks, pledges should not be made. Pledges should be made and financial flows should be increased as soon as possible. But if we want the money to go where it should be going, then finance here should also be investing in all the anti-corruption law enforcement agencies and actors as soon as possible so that the money is actually going where it should be going.
No, it's clear that the spectrum of financing that is needed. On the quality side, while small compared to what's needed for the technical solutions, is still significant and not necessarily being deployed right now. And I think that's a challenge that's coming up across the board. But Felipe, for you, at the World Bank or in a lot of other financial institutions, there is a lot of resources invested in the ex post issues around corruption, the investigations, looking at suspension cases, all these important areas. But you're also thinking, and you alluded to in your comments about the upstream. And really it seems like this enabling environment issue is coming up, the limited capacities for prosecution and for governance on the formal government institutions, better work with supreme audit institutions, which might have limited coverage in countries. What are some of the upstream things you think institutions like the bank and others who provide this technical assistance to countries can provide, so we don't overtax the ex post?
So relating to the World Bank specifically, I think in connection with our investigative work, as you know, the bank's jurisdiction is limited to the protection of our funds, so there's only so much that we can do, and we're actually not able to investigate public officials and government officials in these countries, but we can do when we conduct those investigations and auditing, and when we find evidence of misconduct that potentially relates to those government officials, and when we identify perhaps a systematic misuse of those funds in a particular country, we do refer that evidence to the local authorities. And then, of course, it's really up to their will and capacity to prosecute that themselves. But also, broadly speaking, beyond the World Bank as well, I think we have all of these other multilateral institutions that also have accountability mechanisms, including within the frame of the multilateral climate framework as well. So you have all of these multilateral entities that operate the financing mechanism of UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, for instance. You have the Global Environment Facility, you have GCF, you have the Loss and Damage Fund, you have the Adaptation Fund. So all of these institutions actually are subject to accountability mechanisms. So some of them, including GCF, they have their own. So GCF has an accountability mechanism within its own corporate structure. It's an independent unit to conduct this sort of investigation and oversight over the spending of their own funds. And the other ones that may not have this capability, they're subjected to the controls and accountability mechanisms of their host institutions or their implementing institutions as well. So there's a lot of investment in accountability in that sense as well.
Great, thank you, Felipe. Anouk, turning to you, there's a lot of discussion right now, of course, around the renewal of the international financial architecture, really centered on the climate finance challenge. MDB reform is a G7 and G20 priority. The latest G7 communique from last week is calling for a bigger, better, and more effective MDB system. A lot of that relates to being more efficient, for being more quick, for mobilizing and catalyzing larger amounts of private finance. But we're hearing about these quality issues about how we make finance more effective and more impactful for climate and the urgency of it. In your ideal world, what other aspects do we need to build into that reform process around ensuring social accountability, on ensuring participation, on creating, the kind of enabling environment that Karina was alluding to, because right now that that isn't necessarily a big part of the reform discussions, but clearly if we're going to achieve the kind of goals we want to achieve in the kind of context we need to work in, this seems to be something that needs to be part also of that financial architecture.
Sorry, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Ali. That's again a great question, and I think you're right. I think we've already started to sort of allude to some of those features, but I think I'd take this opportunity to go a little bit deeper again to maybe highlight. I think I love my numbers, so I'm just going to go with 4 things this time that I think need to be sort of kept in mind in terms of enabling conditions, sort of preconditions almost, to going into sort of any conversation around climate finance and trying to ensure that, again, communities are central to those processes. And I think the first is around transparency and sort of access to information, not just in terms of having information put out there about what's going on and how the numbers, but allowing people to access it in a way that's easy, that's, working with civil society to simplify information. I think just having that interface is a fundamental sort of prerequisite to meaningful participation or social accountability initiatives. The second aspect, I think, is a little bit more difficult, but I think speaking to what I said earlier, looking at incentives, I think it's about building political will. So I think that would be my second sort of feature, trying to work with institutions that are either delivering these climate finance mechanisms in country, to highlight why it's important, as Michael was alluding to earlier as well, why there is actually an efficiency gain by bringing citizens and communities on board. So I think trying to leverage those incentives to strengthen political will would be my sort of second precondition. The third, I think, is around, and Shirley spoke to this as well, more generally, but I think around legal mandates and sort of operational frameworks that facilitate, again, participation and social accountability efforts. I think under Article 12 of the Paris Agreement, there's the ACE provision, I guess, which is Action for Climate Empowerment, if I'm right, Shirley. And I think there's a general global mandate for ensuring public participation in climate-related work, but there's an opportunity to leverage national and local legislation, laws, whether they're constitutions, whether they're even local government ordinances, to make sure that public participation and social accountability is not something that's an afterthought, but something that's officially mandated. And finally, and Karina touched on this very eloquently, it's about kind of ensuring that there's this enabling environment and civic space for people to contribute to these conversations. It's about making sure that climate whistleblowers are protected. It's about making sure that environmental defenders don't have to face threats. We had so many conversations throughout the course of this week that that are very heartbreaking. I mean, it doesn't really give you the space to raise these issues, and I think making sure that, I'm saying it very sort of flippantly, but making sure that that enabling environment and the civic space exists for citizens and communities to be part of these conversations would be very critical. And I think, as we have seen from this panel, will require a sort of multifaceted, multi-stakeholder kind of effort, because I think a country trying to doing it on its own is probably not going to succeed. So yeah, just a broad sweep of some of those conditions.
Mm-hmm. No, it's very interesting, Anouk, and going back to the report that Michael alluded to earlier, better accountability, better finance. I mean, there was discussion about, is there a way that in the capital stack of every major, investment project, you have some allocation for these, 1%, 2%, 3% of the project that could support these kinds of initiatives? Because again, when you talk to civil society actors around the world, it's a very ad hoc financing system, sort of scattershot approaches to northern philanthropies, to bilateral donors, closing civic space, new foreign agents laws. It's very difficult to operate today. And the international financial architecture obviously provides a space where you could have some of that funding in tandem, and it exists, but it is also rather not necessarily systemic. We say we have a lot of islands of excellence, and then a lot of deserts. And so thinking through, and we're trying to do that right now. The Global Partnership for Social Accountability at the World Bank was created as one tool for this, but relatively modestly funded and not honestly reaching the scale it might have needed to reach, especially for a challenge like climate that we have today. But Michael, turning to you again, there's also this division of funding ecosystems we see a lot, and there these beautiful walled gardens, as we might want to call them, where, for example, in the philanthropic case, a lot of great innovations are incubated, reach a certain scale, but then aren't often translated into sort of this larger scale financing of government flows, of multilateral finance flows. What can we do to connect better these ecosystems, and to sort of take those innovations that are emerging, especially out of the social sector, which can be linked to public finance, that can provide that quality? Are there ways we can sort of better connect these divided funding ecosystems?
Yes, there's a lot we could do better, and I don't think it's actually rocket science. Like, a lot of it, I think, is just about building the relationships between different sets of funders. An example was a conversation you and I were both in yesterday, Ali, on the sidelines of this conference, which brought together some of the philanthropies and the bilateral donors and multilaterals, comparing notes on the different support mechanisms that are out there for protecting anti-corruption activists and environmental defenders. Like, well, there are various offerings that are being provided. Still not enough to reach the scale of the issue, but often they're being created in parallel without talking to each other. Often, as a result, you end up with them all clustering, serving the same geographies, and then again, you get these deserts where there isn't the types of coverage. So part of it is just building an active knowledge flow between different types of funders about where they're funding, on what, and building a more informed understanding of where the gaps are. I think it's about building and reflecting the comparative advantages that different funders have. I mean, I think philanthropy, it's not as nimble as, in theory, or it's reputed to be. They have their own bureaucracies, as I've learned as well. Maybe not quite on the bank scale, but they're still real. But it is true that they are probably more effective at getting funds quicker to civil society groups than some other funders. So how do you leverage that in combination with what a bilateral or multilateral donor might have, which is a really strong relationship with the government, which might help them push to build some of these more inclusive pieces into the design of projects and allocations at those stages. So I think there are these comparative advantages that we could leverage far more effectively, but that you need to have a sense of being part of a collective climate finance community to be able to make those connections get realized and build on those comparative advantages. And at the moment, I don't think we have as effective as we should have a climate integrity finance community. And those of us who are bought into it are sort of knocking on the edges of the big climate finance discussion, saying, hey, this is important, pay attention. The real win would be when we're not having this conversation at the anti-corruption conference, but we're having it at the COP, and it's initiated from their side. So I think that's the shift in mindset we need to build towards, and I think we can get there. I think the numbers will drive it in the end. These are real risks, and they are preventable to a certain extent. So let's work to make sure that we're mitigating those risks. But yes, I think it goes hand. Last thing I say, I think it goes hand in hand, and we can leverage this too with the localization agenda. A lot of the points we're making are about more funding closer to the ground where the work needs to happen, and that also creates incentives for stronger ownership and oversight. And again, too much of the climate finance is not actually getting down to local level yet, and that's true of philanthropic. It's true of the broader pots of money. But I think it's 1% goes to climate finance funds end up with indigenous like serving indigenous peoples, for example, even though they're the most effective stewards of the environment that are out there. So, so I think we can also push on that sort of moment of zeitgeist at the moment to like funders feeling pressure to get more funds to the local. That is very much in service of this agenda as well, even if they're not using that language, but we should be reinforcing that. So, so yeah, part of it's just getting the people talking to each other, and I know you do that, Ali, and we're appreciative of it. I think the facility you're talking about, like as a successor to the GPSA and the bank, could be another vehicle for that, but we need more of those.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you, Michael. And you know, the other aspect I think you know, we were all talking about earlier, because you know, we do talk together before we come here and talk to you, is on the digital enabling that now is also a very important tool. You know, engaging people at scale, looking at, you know, anti-corruption data at scale, using AI/ML to surface patterns that otherwise would have been difficult to surface. You know, these are tools which can enable transparency and oversight at scale in a way we haven't done before. But we're just at the cusp of this. And Shirley, I know you were reflecting a little bit about how, you know, in a lot of these environment e-government approaches, you know, digital engagement oversight approaches could bring, you know, a change and allow us to have, you know, quicker ways to ensure that integrity risks are being well managed. So could you reflect a little more on how you think this makes a difference and how we deploy this more effectively?
Yes, so we've been talking a little bit about solutions here. And yes, e-government, as a matter of fact, can provide a solution to mitigate integrity risks. But then the question goes back to funding and the extent to which financiers are ready to pay for digital transformation. Obviously, government, digital transformation, but also, you know, we haven't been talking about the private sector and the role of the private sector in all this. Because, of course, you know, funding comes from World Bank and other multilateral institutions, but the private sector has a big role to play in you know, investing into the transition and making sure that integrity risks are being mitigated. And the private sector has the resources and can leverage resources to help tackle the climate crisis, and can also invest in digital transformation, right? We have lots of tech companies actually, you know, working on various tech solutions, using big data to advance solutions on climate. So I assume those same companies could also, you know, provide some solutions when it comes to specific e-government solutions. So I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say about the private sector, but I think they are a very important actor that we should be keeping in mind when identifying and mitigating integrity risk. Something I wanted to say, though, for the private sector. So we've been talking a lot about public participation. We've been talking a lot about how to engage communities. We must do that. But now, in terms of enabling environments, I'm sure everybody in that room have been maybe following, you know, regulatory developments at the EU level. But we're going to have the CS3D coming up as a corporate sustainability due diligence directive. In that particular directive, it's very much about human rights due diligence, but it's also about climate. It's also about the environment. It's about, you know, obligations that are going to be imposed on large companies, EU and non-EU companies, on human rights and environmental due diligence. In that text, stakeholder engagement is going to be a legal obligation. And people will have to engage stakeholders and affected stakeholders along the way and document the ways they've been engaging those stakeholders. So that's an avenue that we should not be forgetting. And in our experience, it is very difficult to actually, people don't know how to engage stakeholders, right? So the largest companies, it's not like they don't want to do it, it's more about how you do that. And maybe that's something, you know, to be to be taken on by civil society, by NGOs, just coming up with some, tools and guidance on how private sector can engage affected communities effectively, or can find credible proxies, or can get in touch with NGOs. So it's all about connecting the dots, but on public participation and stakeholder engagement, we are going to have legal obligations that will, I assume, will be helpful down the way.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. And I think, there's a lot of, tech solutions are going to be surfaced for governments, and this collaboration with the private sector is critical, and there's a lot of emerging tech that I think it can actually also enable civil society and participation. USAID has recently launched a grand challenge to surface some of those innovations around the carbon markets. We launched a tech accelerator for green accountability with the Climate Collective to show what are these sort of participatory technologies that exist that are also often transferable from private sector applications that can enhance inclusion and participation as well. And these range from AI/ML solutions to benefit payment tracking to GIS systems that ground truth with communities. So there's a lot of solutions that are also deployable in low bandwidth or no bandwidth environments as well. And so I think we really have to think about enabling tech today as well. Let me open it up to the audience here. There'll be microphones that can come around for anyone, and we have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. So I see a lady here to start.
Thank you so much for your session. My name is Katya Losova from CIPE, Center for International Private Enterprise. So my question is about the timing, actually, some of the upcoming deadlines or milestones that you have. You mentioned various challenges and various solutions to integrity solutions, but what is your sense of timing? How much time do we have to implement that? Just to give us some of better understanding of that. Thanks.
Okay. Good question on timing. Shirley, any views on some of that? So quick question. Anyone else on timing? I mean, it's the fierce urgency of now, I think, is the short answer for all of this. But
I would just say using all of these important negotiations or conferences would really be good. So we have the COP in Azerbaijan. By the way, the World Bank has been providing funding for over 30 years in Azerbaijan, not 20. I just wanted to highlight that. And this is where we are with the enabling environment in Azerbaijan. But sorry, not to digress. But we have some very important milestones with the COP. We have the UNTAC later this year, and then we have the UNCAC Conference of States Parties. I mean, I would just say that because it's an emergency situation, crisis, and we want to try to raise attention and get action, we should be trying to do everything we can at these different venues. I know for the private sector, there was a private sector forum at the COSP in Atlanta. I wonder what was done there on climate. I would just say for CIPE, it would be great if you could use those opportunities as well to bring the private sector around. I completely agree with what Shirley was saying, and just obviously more broadly, that the private sector, the urgency for the private sector to do more on that. So, yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes, up here.
Yes, hello. I come from Transparency International Greenland. And I call for a strategy on how to reach out to small states. Because we do not have the capacity and the money to start projects. But we have the local knowledge, and we are an NGO. I can say that a lot of research is done in Greenland. Researchers fly in and fly out, but there's no local participation. So my answer is, could you, when you make a strategy, include and say you must have the local with the projects?
Okay. We'll take that as guidance to the panel on that work, please.
Could I maybe, because mine is also a bit related to that question. I'm with GIZ, I work in Uganda, I think a lot of this is very interesting, but it's also at a very high level. And I think it's good World Bank, you have all these things, now you have a focus on climate sensitive financing. But how do you actually ensure that you don't just rely on the countries that you're giving the money to, that they're doing it, that it's not just becoming a ticking boxing exercise, but really working with where the money is being spent with the local community? It also goes a bit to the social accountability, because we don't have any actors here who is actually representing local civil society at the very local level, like in the districts, in for example, in Uganda, where the projects are. So how do we ensure that we get those voices? So it's not just ticking a box.
No, I think that's a very good question, and I think, I mean, part of the discussions, you know, we've been having here this week are about that. How do you connect the local? How do you connect that to the national? How do you connect that then to government systems? How do you build that vertical chain? And then actually, how do you get that to influence global policy dialogue? And I think that chain is often missing. We've done it in certain places. And Anouk, maybe you can speak to some of the examples where those cases have been built, but they're built in particular projects, they're built in particular interventions, they're not always built. That's part of the problem. And why aren't we doing this systemically? If there's such a broad consensus that this kind of work is critical to ensure end results are reaching beneficiary, that participatory oversight is key to results, why is this a boutique business, you know? It's not that it's not done. And, you know, of course, in all projects, certain standards are met, you know, do no harm principles are met, you know, environmental and social safeguards are met, but that additional work we're talking about doesn't happen everywhere. But maybe you can speak to an example or two where it happens and
Sure,
why
no,
we should do
thanks.
more.
Thanks so much. I love that question. I feel like you've sort of had this conversation with me beforehand as well, because I think the example that I'd like to share is actually from Uganda as well, because Transparency International, who I work for as well, our local chapter there, has led this very, very innovative work. I mean, I can't speak to, you know, World Bank, including it in sort of financing processes, obviously, but what TI Uganda has done is, you might be already familiar with community barazzas, where climate finance schemes are sort of run, and TI Uganda works very, very closely with local communities to make sure that they are part of the conversations, both in terms of the allocation of the finance and the projects, working with local leaders, and making sure that there's a monitoring process right from the start all the way to the end. So there's that kind of closing of the feedback loop. And this community Baratza scheme is very much a social accountability mechanism, a social accountability approach that is being led by local civil society. The funding probably comes from elsewhere, but you're working with local leaders, building the capacity of civil society and communities at the same time. So I think that speaks to one example, plenty more, you know, across the TI movement for sure, that I think hopefully answer your question.
Yeah, and I think it's a critical question, because sometimes these participatory oversight initiatives are linked to small projects or in certain districts. But, you know, they really need to be linked to the larger scale investments, and they can be, you know, whether it's an energy investment, whether it's a large scale adaptation scheme, that you can build these kinds of mechanisms into actually very large scale investments. But like Michael and others were saying, it takes some allocation within a project or in parallel financing to do this. And that's often a missing piece of the puzzle. It's not always available, but it's a very good question. Did you have a hand up, Brice? No? Okay. Yes, here in the front. There's a mic coming. Right?
Yeah, thank you so much. I wasn't going to speak, but I do want to thank you for bringing up that point. In Greenland, in the Caribbean, where I'm from, and in Puerto Rico, where I work, the same thing happens. We have experts coming in all the time, evaluating everything around disaster risk reduction, tax issues, etc. They come and go, and we're still not at these spaces. Agree with you completely about Uganda as well. Alison, I thought a lot of your points, I'm sorry, Ali, a lot of your points were very important, and I hope that next year this same panel includes more people from civil society on the panel, because we just need solutions. I mean, we're grateful that development banks and other agencies are here and have come together with a lot of staff, but we have to be more effective with these spaces, and funding has to go directly to civil society voices, because these spaces are continuously being occupied by other spaces. And so if we're going to build our capacity, if we're going to learn, and if we're going to sit at the table with you, we need more access to these spaces, more training, and more funding. Okay? And so one of you, I think, talked also about indigenous community being the best climate activists. So how do we get them here? And how do we fund their projects? It's really about funding. So I'm happy yesterday there was a side meeting about funding. I hope, again, there's more local voices at those tables as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll turn to a few of our civil society representatives here. I mean, rest assured, there is an effort underway, but I think we need more advocacy. We need more voices from the South calling for this kind of financing. I mean, there have been meetings here as well. There's been extensive consultations with Global South civil society groups, hundreds of them, in fact, about what their needs are and how to better reflect them. But it requires significant resources that aren't necessarily currently allocated, and I think that's part of the discussion that needs to be had. It's a very compelling point you're raising.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think also more broadly on the funding issue, I believe there was a letter that Accountability Lab led to the World Bank that has over 300 organizations signed on, including my organization, the UNCAC Coalition, that's advocating for, I think a monitoring mechanism of substantial amounts, I think millions, for civil society. And it's not just, it's important for the climate, tackling the climate crisis, but like at a fundamental level, it is extremely challenging for civil society. For example, a lot of grants, as you may know, right, and many of us know in this room are from civil society, are project-based. They're not even core funding. And so it's incredibly difficult, like to try to deal with a climate crisis or whatever the priority is in your country and the world that you want to try to help, to do it when you're just like constantly trying to apply for funding over here and funding over there, So I think at that basic level, there's a lot of problems in that, but that's not just for the climate crisis, that's more broadly. And then reading, I think it's a really good point, for the next panel, next IACC. Maybe I missed this, but it would be great to have some panels about community-driven, approaches. For example, there's I think Shirley, you sent around some developing programs on public participation in climate projects. There's a locally led approach that World Resources Institute has documented, like case studies of locally led initiatives on climate projects in different countries. And so it'd be very interesting to have a focus of that, those kinds of examples, real life examples, and then also, like you're saying, very concrete discussions as well about the financing, how to get the funding for civil society to play those different kinds of roles. So, but I don't know, Michael, you should probably want to add to that.
I mean, I think there's so much work to be done, and I completely hear your points. And I mean, some of our member funders, groups like Ford Foundation, are increasingly shifting, like the share of their funds that are going to indigenous-led funding mechanisms and to much more global South-based civil society. The trend is in the right direction. I think they would also admit that they're not where they need to be yet, but the trend is in the right direction. I think influencing the bigger pots of money to, go in that same direction is tough. Like USAID put out this ambitious 25% localization pledge, and personally, I completely applaud that, but they also just put out this week that they're not making much progress. It's really tough. And these bureaucracies and the systems that get built are very hard and slow moving to change. So, maybe that means we need to be more radical and consider, and I think the core funding piece is part of that. Like, if you're going to support these groups, do trust-based funding. Like, just don't put all these ties on it. Don't require all the reporting. And that ties to the urgency need as well. Like, people need the money now. They don't need it 6 months later after verifying 10 million particular data points that your particular donor requires. So there's a lot of just good practice on the funding side that we could scale and do better. But my other point is I also don't think you want civil society engagement that is just performative, like giving a slot on the table and then you don't really change anything. What you actually need is probably their own spaces where they're properly resourced and then they're able to act on their own agendas, and it's not just joining into an existing space. And there are some of those spaces that don't have an integrity or anti-corruption explicit label on them, but where they probably are talking about things that really get to these same issues, and we need to build across, like support some of that cross-community dialogue, I think, as well.
Very quickly, so I'm a former civil society and I'm also a former OSF. And I work now for the private sector, for a private firm. What I would say is, from an NGO standpoint, yes, the funding is always an issue, and core funding is always an issue as well, is project-based, although there's some movement. But sometimes NGOs forget to knock the door of the private sector because, there are less bureaucracy in the private sector. It's straightforward. So Lush, for example, it's a cosmetic company. They do have a grant-giving facility and they give away cash to human rights defenders, right? And you have other companies who might be in a position to provide cash more easily. I'm not saying all of them, you have to do your due diligence, you have to do your research, but I think it's an option, and sometimes that option is entirely overlooked. In terms to your point about, yes, engaging with communities, and global law firms, sometimes they do actually do that, and I act for national pacts, and I engage affected stakeholders as much as I can when helping them establish grievance mechanisms and engaging with indigenous people, because otherwise how can you advise? You cannot provide the legal advice if you don't engage with the people who needs that help. So it does happen, maybe sometimes it's not being mentioned or being said, but I would say, it's good to be thinking also of the private sector and how, you can use the private sector to help you out as well.
Felipe, any closing thoughts from you?
Well, I think we discussed a lot about how to involve civil society in this, and I think there are some initiatives already in place to enable that in the climate space as well. So I think, of course, there's a lot that can be done, including at the COP. And I think, to your point earlier, currently there's no standing dedicated integrity and governance item on the COP agenda, which is an entirely missed opportunity there. And I think that could be an option to invite contributions and feedback also from civil society to include those matters as a priority on the negotiation agenda. But there has been some progress as well. And I think one thing I would highlight in terms of transparency, as Anouk was saying as well, and milestones too. So this year, there will be the first edition of this enhanced transparency reporting under the Paris Agreement. So if you're not aware, the parties to the Paris Agreement will begin reporting biannually on very specific items, including their emissions, but also financial assistance provided and received under this framework. And this will be open to the public. It will be reviewed by experts. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there for oversight, including from civil society. So I think that's something that we should be on the lookout for.
Anything to close?
Just very briefly, I think I just wanted to also acknowledge, your very, very pertinent question. I think it's critical that those voices are represented, but also sort of acknowledge what Michael was saying at the end, that, when those voices are heard, they need to be sort of meaningful and not just sort of tick box performative exercises. And I think just sort of trying to strike that balance is where the compulsion is. And I think we have even colleagues in the room from Transparency International from our chapters. We have TI Pakistan, not to sort of put you on the spot, but, where we're working very closely with local communities there, and I think the transformative work that is happening and where those voices really need to be on this panel. I had a few minutes to sort of reflect one example from Uganda, but I think just across the board, we have some really exciting work, and I think it's just trying to strike that balance from just to make sure that things are meaningful, inclusive, and sort of very, very accountable. And I think there's a role for all stakeholders to play, even as Shirley was saying, including the private sector as well. So thank you for this space as well.
Let me just close. We're out of time. But so thanks everyone. We had really good questions, and one thing, this call for greater financing, greater involvement for civil society, I think it's well heard. You heard it from all the panelists here. There are examples of this work happening in a lot of quarters, but there's a need for a lot more. One place you can go to is something we're piloting called the Green Accountability Platform. Go to greenaccountability.org. This is a way to fund local civil society to create systems to oversee the quality of climate finance in 5 pilot countries, and that's being implemented right now. But it's something that could be scaled, much more broadly. We're building a successor to the GPSA. It relates to the letter that civil society wrote to Ajay Banga. So there is an approval to build a dedicated civil society facility at a greater scale. But of course, that needs to be resourced by the World Bank itself, by donors, by others in tandem with the rest of this financing. But I think the key thing is to also not have these resources sit in isolation. They really need to influence the broader scope of public and private financing coming in. So local voices are critical. I think you've heard a broad perspective. Thank you to all our panelists for sort of very rich contributions. You see the integrity spectrum ranges, from so many different across so many different actors, and I want to thank all of you for also very engaged, pointed and thoughtful questions. So thanks again, and enjoy the last day of the IACC. And thanks to Transparency International for hosting us today.
Can I just make a plug for the civil society? The UNCAC Coalition has an environmental crime and corruption working group chaired by the Wildlife Justice Commission, who I should have definitely acknowledged as being part of this research. If you'd like to join the working group to advocate, advance reforms in different fora, please feel free to come and talk to me. Thank you.